This conference will now be recorded.
And that way, after the session, if you want to share with other colleagues, friends, please do. We post on our website, archercareer.com, under the Insights section. So for tonight, our topic is about interviewing. And we're talking particularly about this environment that we're in. Interviewing is always stressful, even under the best of circumstances. But for sure, given the environment right now, there's some added pressure, particularly if you're someone who perhaps has either lost a job opportunity because of being let go due to downsizing, or had a job offer that was pulled back because of the economic conditions. We're going to talk a little bit about that, and also address, if you are sitting on the side making those hiring decisions, there's a different type of pressure, but certainly pressure as well. And I'm really excited to have my colleague Patty Hurley with us tonight. I'm going to have her introduce herself in a minute, but just to cover a couple of introductory things regarding our agenda. We're just going to walk through a few topics about interviewing, speak a little bit to what it's like to be in the seat of the hiring manager, talk about some key things for success, particularly in a highly competitive, really difficult environment. And then Patty's going to take over and talk about some of the research strategies that we think are a particularly important aspect to interviewing. And then I'm going to talk about some of the focus things regarding your background and aligning to the organization. And with that, we'll just do a quick introduction again. My name is Pam Schilling. For those of you that I've had a chance to work with in the past, have gotten to know, I run Archer Career as our Chief Executive Officer and lead the coaching work that we do. I've worked in coaching for about the last 10 years. I've been through two really significant recessions before this one, so can appreciate this environment. And a lot of my clients and colleagues that I'm working with now and talking to are students early in their career, seasoned professionals as well, and just trying to be as open and honest about this environment right now as we possibly can, and also sharing a lot of the insights about what it takes to really get hired. And as I mentioned, I'm joined by my colleague, Patty. I'm excited that she's part of this conversation. I'll let her introduce her background more specifically, but I've known Patty for over a decade. We've worked together informally and formally in a lot of ways, and I'm excited to have her share some of her perspective. So Patty, if you would share a little more about your background.
Yeah, so my background is about 12, maybe 15 years ago. I went from being an at-home mom and part-time working in a high school, and I dived in and I went back to grad school, and I went to grad school online, and I got a graduate degree in information science with an emphasis on library instruction and teaching. And then I also went back a little after that and got a master's in education with instructional design and course design emphasis. So in the last 10 years, I've been working in higher ed, particularly as both a research librarian, but as a research consultant for students, and also working on curriculum design and instruction design. And then I came to Archer about a year ago. So, and I'm head of content at Archer, and instructional design there. So I've had a nice experience and a nice career working with, I would say, primarily young professionals in the and not just college age. One of my niches has always been adults returning to higher ed who are usually in career changes. That's why they return to higher ed, either to a community college or a four-year school. And that's usually been the area that I've worked most heavily in. I think that's about it. Anything else, Pam? I think that
No, that's
covers.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Patty.
Hmm.
So a couple things before we jump into our discussion. Obviously, you all have joined our webinar for some particular purpose. We're continuing to do this as an open forum for anyone of any, sort of career situation, trying to think about all kinds of topics that are relevant. So we do have some upcoming webinars. The next session, we're going to talk about resumes and some of the things that we know from our work that really hone a resume and help it align to get the attention of the hiring organization. We're then going to have a webinar following that talks about handling the stress of the environment that we're in. I do some sub work within coaching, but also as an adjunct professor, I've taught some courses on resilience, and I just think that's something that we all can use little bits of right now. And then we're going to do another session in June about just the overall kind of end-to-end job search process. And to maybe plant a little bit of a seed, I'm going to ask a question at the end of the session today about other particular career topics, job search topics that are of interest to you all as our audience, and how we might then shape that into a specialized webinar. So keep that in mind, and I'll come back to solicit some of that feedback. And one other kind of logistical thing in some of the coaching work that I'm doing, I'm opening up my calendar a bit to provide coaching for a very small fee, and I'm donating 100% of that fee to a local business that's in my community. It's the way that I'm finding that I can give back both to individuals that want coaching input and guidance, but maybe can't typically avoid or afford the cost of a career coach. I've had a number of great conversations with different professionals with different backgrounds. So if that's something you're interested in, that's on our website as well. Great. So again, back to our talk tonight. I'm going to speak a little bit about the big picture of interviewing and try to put some of this in context, and then think about some of the things that might be unique to the environment right now. And then Patty and I are going to drill down on interview techniques and strategies that really make a difference. We are doing a tremendous amount still in this environment of helping individuals prepare for interviews. And there's a lot, of course, at stake in those circumstances. And so what are some of the things that we're finding really differentiate candidate A from candidate B? And then we'll just talk about a few helpful tips that do, again, make a little bit of a difference depending on your circumstances, but again, trying to take into consideration some of the pressures that we're feeling, particularly when it feels like a lot of interviews might not be forthcoming, and so therefore the one that's in front of us really matters. So let me jump in with a couple of thoughts about being in the seat of the hiring manager. I think it's important to start here because today most hiring decisions are made by a person. They are ultimately made by the person that you're going to work for. And I, and also Patty, we are in that seat right now. We're in a hiring process. We're hiring an intern to join our company this summer. I've hired people in the past. I know what it's like. I've hired, people in good times and in difficult economic environments. And I think sometimes as a candidate, we tend to focus more on how we want to explain our background. And it's almost as if we're interviewing looking in the mirror. And so what I want to just emphasize for a couple of minutes is that when you're approaching an interview, I think it's valuable to remember that you are trying to help solve the challenges that the hiring manager is facing, and to influence that individual that you are someone who will come in, be a part of their team, be loyal to them and their agenda, and help them tackle the challenges that the business is facing. So as a hiring manager, I think there are many things that go on, and there is some psychology behind this. There's also a tremendous amount of research, academic research, that proves some of this. The hiring manager, when they're looking at you as a candidate, I think is asking a few questions. One, can you help me fix my problems? So I go home at night, or in many of our cases, I walk down the hallway and I'm thinking about all the challenges that I'm facing tomorrow. And I'm asking myself, can this person that I just interviewed help me fix my problems, or fix the problems of the business, or help us pursue the opportunities that we need to tackle? That's one of the most important questions. I think the second question as a hiring manager that we're asking, and I believe that in this particular environment, this is a very critical thing to be thinking about. How much do I have to manage this person? And what training are you going to need? So in the best circumstances, I see potential and I see someone who can learn, and I'm willing to put you on a little bit of a runway. But the thing is, in economic shocks, in crisis, when I can only add one person to my team instead of two, I might be looking for that person that has a tremendous amount of initiative, a lot of demonstrated, being a self-starter, and is already holding a lot of the skills that I need. Now, that does not mean that if you're in college or fresh out of college or fresh out of a graduate program that you can't fit that need. But I think you have to be really good about articulating those type of things. And this question of how much do I have to manage you for environments where right now we're going to be working remotely, that question is being asked a lot. I mean, our team just did a debrief probably about 45 minutes ago. And we have an intern who will be working virtually, and that was one of the questions that we were, discussing amongst ourselves. So that's a factor. I think the third factor, which is always the case, but it's worth talking about, is, are you someone who's going to fit in the team? Do you fit into the company culture? All companies have a mission, they have a style of working, they have degrees of bureaucracy, they have approaches to communication. And is it clear that if I hire you, you either are going to fit into that or you're going to adapt into it? And that has some really interesting implications. And then the final thing that I think we always have to be aware of, this is the psychology again, and please don't take offense to this when I say it, but as a hiring manager, I want to brag about the person I hire. And I remember having a moment where this was articulated to me in a really obvious way. So I follow graduate business schools. A few years back, the University of Virginia's Darden School hired a new dean. He came from McKinsey and Company. And I remember reading an article by the faculty member who led that search. And the quote was, "I can't believe we were so lucky to be able to hire this person." And that just reminded me that when a manager is hiring someone, they're going to turn to their colleagues and say, "Oh my gosh, I made an offer, this person accepted it. I can't wait. I'm so excited." And there's a little bit of that, kind of egoism that comes in. So that factors into some of the decision making. And when you take all that together, what I think it means is that hiring managers can be risk averse, especially in times now. There are pressures internally to hire perhaps an internal candidate or a referral, and sometimes that can clog up the process. Sometimes the paper credentials make me feel more confident in the decision that I'm making. And if I can only hire one person, I might be going to a traditional decision-making framework that perhaps has worked in the past. So this isn't in any way intended to paint a dark cloud over the prospects of what goes on at the hiring decision-making. But what it says is there's some particular things that you can do as a candidate in the interview process. And so that leads me into a couple of points about what we find. And I think lots and lots of coaches, I know some of the people joining us on this call are themselves coaches. We talk about to clients and students and individuals that we're working with, what makes a difference? What are some of the key success factors? And these are some of the things that Patty and I are going to elaborate on more in this conversation. So there are 6 things that I'm going to highlight as an introduction. Key success factors. So number 1 is research. We know that one of the things that hiring managers tell us when we talk to them is that candidates that don't succeed often don't know enough about the company, or they don't know enough about the job. And that may seem like a super simple thing, but when Patty and I talk about this shortly and we give you some of the examples, you're going to see what some people do, and then you can benchmark that against how you perhaps have prepared in the past. So research is critical. There's also the second thing is how well aligned you are in terms of the role and the job to your experience. Sometimes people don't speak about it well enough, but that alignment is key. Number 3 is really planning ahead for the interview. So are you thoughtful about the kinds of things that you're going to talk about, the stories, the experiences? That planning ahead is critical. And then number 4, do you prepare? Do you speak out loud the kinds of things that you're going to say in an interview? And number 5, do you project in your delivery confidence? If I've got all these challenging issues, I want to look someone in the eye and feel that you feel confident that you can help solve those issues. And then the 6th thing is this idea, and I'm going to call it intention. Do I understand your motives, your rationale for wanting to be a part of our organization? And can you articulate that in a clear and succinct way? So those 6 things enable you to be successful as a candidate. And of course, there's other things that might come in and add a little bit of noise, but you can only control your part so much. And so what it means, I think it boils down to the must-haves of being very clear about why you want a job, being very clear about why you think you're the best candidate for the job, and having well-researched and developed points on why you want to work for that company. And so what sometimes gets in the way is how you articulate those elements in an interview. And so what Patty and I are going to do for about the next hour is we're going to talk through a couple of these different areas that hit on those key success factors. All right. So Patty, I'm going to turn over to you and have you take us through some of the thoughts you have about research.
That's great. And for a couple people who came late, I just want to reintroduce myself really fast, if that's okay, Pam.
Please, I think that's great.
Yeah, so for those who came in late, I'm Patty Hurley. I have a master's degree in library and information science and a master's degree in education theory and instructional and content design. And at Archer, I'm the head of content and research. So my past experience had me really working often with adults who returned to school because they were doing job searches, or young people at the end of their careers, either graduate or undergraduate, who were heading into the workforce. And often the advice where my role comes in is helping them do that background research for both the job and the company. And I would often say that I think people, when you get that phone call that say they want you to come in for the interview, our gut reaction is to start practicing interviewing, right? And and there's a certain amount of tension that builds up when we start doing that. Like, right, what questions are they going to ask? How am I going to tell my story? How well do I know my resume? And my one big thing I would say here is take a deep breath and stop. Pat yourself on the back because you got the call to come in for an interview. And then pull back a little. And before you even start all that drilling about the interview process and your resume and your story, do have a research strategy about the job and the company. It serves two purposes. Can you guys hear me still? Good. It serves two purposes. One is that it allows you to get a sense of control early in the stage of the interview process, so that you feel like you have a plan, you know what you're going to do, and it just makes you feel good moving forward. Then focus and develop a strategy for evolving that research. So I would say come up with a basic outline. You need to know a little information about the industry. You need to know a little information about the company. And you need to know information that's about the job but may not be in the job posting. You don't need a lot. I wouldn't get lost in this process or go down rabbit holes, but you do need to have some bullet points about each of those three research areas: the industry, the company, the job. Now, what this does is it also gives you a sense of control and confidence in the actual interview, because you'll be asked questions about all three that you are expected to have a well-rounded and I think a pretty deep knowledge about. And that is often, both when I've been on hiring committees and also when I've talked to people on hiring committees and hiring managers, that has been where people have lost points in the rubric, is not being able to answer these broader questions about the industry and the company and the job. I'm going to move on, if that's okay, and I'm going to talk about where to start that process. Pam, did you want to add anything here?
No,
Okay, so
Patty, I think you're spot on.
So great. So if you guys don't mind, I'm going to jump in and maybe give you some tips about where to start with that. So I appreciate that the audience today can come from a wide range of different backgrounds, and I'm going to try to hit some wide range resources for you guys to use. I really, and I know this seems like a crazy kind of cop-out answer, but hear me through here. To do that industry and that company background, going to Wikipedia is not a crazy option, but that is not the actual answer. Going to Wikipedia and scrolling all the way down to the reference section is actually what your professional librarian here is going to tell you to do. You want to scroll all the way down to the resources that were used to create that Wikipedia entry for if your company is a big enough company to be listed on Wikipedia, and that will give you actually the place to start deep diving into some company information. Big companies like Fortune 500 companies, their Wikipedia pages are very much controlled by their PR department. And so it's a good, nice place to jump into before you jump to the company website. The second place I would also recommend you go to on the web is to go to the Security and Exchange Commission's government site to get the financial reports. And that is simply Googling your company, the word and then doing sec.gov. and it will pull up in that Google search, usually their last quarterly reports and any other additional amendment filings that they had to put in. So those would be my two first web resources that you should go to. For more specific resources, if you are currently a student anywhere, your institution's library page, database page, is your automatic go-to. So if you are a local university student, or you're in grad school, or you're even just taking one class, you automatically get access to all of your institution's databases and resources, and I would leverage those for your own use. If you are not in that situation, if you are currently someone who's in the workforce or you're no longer in school, this is the time, if you haven't already, this is my pitch for the public library. So through your public library, every database that you probably have resource to at your institution, the library also has a subscription to. I would think the only exception is smaller libraries may not have EBIS, but that might be the only exception. If you are currently not a library member, but we are living in the world of COVID, contacting your public library right now through an email or their chat, and all you got to do is ask for an e-library access number, and they will give you a special code so that you can access all of their resources online from your home through their portal. Now, what does this get you? Whether it's through your institution or your public library, it gets you access to Hoover's, Morningstar, Crane's Chicago Business, Wall Street Journal, Ref USA. Those are all really, really good places to look up both industry reports and company reports. It will also get you access to the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times without having to pay for them. And actually that is where your public library is probably better than an institutional library. So those are the places you should be kind of going to do that background research. The web is a great place to start, but unfortunately going behind the paywall to a Hoover's or a Crane or a Wall Street Journal or a Ref USA will give you much more specific and accurate data for both your company and your industry background. I would also add a little pitch here that your librarian at both an institution and at a public library, they are great for helping you specifically get to the information that you need. Do not be ever afraid to ask for them. During this time in COVID, when we're all sheltering at home, every library, well, not every library, every public library has a chat feature where you can ask a public librarian any question about any resource they have. And that is as easy as I am trying to look up about, you know, the background, I need the financial report for Google because I have an interview, and your public librarian will help you get that. So that is, and your institution, if you belong to an institution right now, those librarians also, the bigger ones all have chat librarians, and they're also answering those questions. So there are people who are there to help you. Use them. They're used to those resources. They know how to get into them. And lots of public libraries actually have business librarians for just this reason. So what do some of these things get you? Like, what do you get? So you want a company overview, right? Searching out the mission and values of the company would be also one of your bullet points. Current financial reports would be worth your time. Industry trends is actually huge. I cannot stress enough finding out or looking at a couple resources and coming up with what you think are the industry trends, or you pull out the industry trends, that is definitely leverageable in both the interview process. You'll be asked about it. You bringing it up is part of great storytelling. Um, and then press releases and current news articles, like I would call it the gossip. Those are also really, really helpful to be able to leverage in an interview. The more that you actually bring to the table about your background knowledge about the company, the industry, and the job, the more that you're able to engage in a conversation with your interviewer. So it doesn't always have to be just waiting for them to ask the question. If you have this kind of deep background about these things, the company overview, the mission values, the trends, the gossip, you're actually able to have a much more conversational discussion, and that actually makes you stand out among the other interviewees.
And Patty, can I
Hmm.
interject? I know you and I were
Yes.
talking about this.
Hmm.
Some of it is if you have a limited amount of time to do research. Now, some of you may have 2, 3, 4 weeks before an interview. There's something about prioritization because, clearly we live in the information age where anybody could spend 50,000 hours doing research.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some of these things you're
And
talking about, how do you suggest prioritizing the research?
yeah, so those, that last group, I kind of think that's your kind of top bullet points: the company overview, the mission and values, the most current financial report, trends, and maybe the last press release or news articles about your company would be what, if I had an interview tomorrow, those would be the 5 things I would seek out first. And I would really, if I had just the web and no other resources, and it's a tight turnaround, that is where I would use, I would do the reference page in Wikipedia first, if my company's big enough to be on Wikipedia. Otherwise, I would do the SEC report, and then the company webpage, and do the about section and pull from there first also.
Yep. And what about for companies who are nonprofits or small companies that are not publicly traded? Are those same resources valuable, or do you have other suggestions for those type of organizations?
So this is where Cranes and Wall Street Journals is helpful to you, right? And using your public library to get access, or your institutional library to get access to those. Cranes often have Ref USA. So Ref USA is more likely to be at a public library, but lots of big institutions also have it. And that's where non-for-profits and government organizations and smaller companies will be listed, and you'll at least get an overview of those companies. So that would be my first go-to in that sense. And some Ref USA is also available online without having to do a subscription. So that's a really good resource for those mid-sized to smaller companies, or those non-mainstream companies. Can I also just add one thing, because I was thinking about this when you were talking, Pam, is if anyone in this group is in a position where they might be interviewing for a non-for-profit or a government or any sort of company that is very mission driven, it is very important to be able to answer the mission and value part of that, but to also make sure that you're in alignment and that that company fits your mission and values also. So
Yeah.
doing that background information, that's a really important conversation, and it does really stand out in an interview when you say, this is these are my mission and values, and your company aligns with me, is very helpful and very good to have. That I wanted to say that a little earlier too.
Yeah, and what I think also, if I could say, what Patty's talking about are a lot of the secondary research sources that are at our disposal. You know, most of you listening, you probably have an academic institution that you're affiliated with.
Mm-hmm.
If you're an alumnus, think about reaching out to the career offices. Sometimes, especially in times like this, they will either help you dig into some of their resources or give you temporary access. And there also, I think, might be just, I'm trying to think about the academic institutions that I'm a part of. Sometimes you have a business set of resources because the business schools have certain subscriptions. Sometimes the university itself has certain subscriptions. So be a little bit resourceful to not just necessarily go to one place. And then you might be able to speak to the career office, whether it's, you know, your current student or an alumnus. And then sometimes you might even be able to go directly to the research librarian. So the idea is to find some of those sources that just get you a little bit deeper than what you could find through a generalized Google search.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess Pam's very true. It's your instinct is to go straight to the web and just Google it, right? And I think I can't tell you not to. That's not a bad thing to do, but you might want to go to these resources first and then go back to the web afterwards, and take that broader, actually third sources out from there.
Mm-hmm. And Patty, there was a question. Do you have any suggestions on researching private companies? So not nonprofits,
Mm-hmm.
for profit, but they're not, you know, traded on one of the stock
Yeah.
exchanges.
So this is hard. So private companies don't have to make themselves public, and you often won't find. Hoover's does actually do a pretty decent job of about covering at least a third of the private business industry. So you will still, like my husband works for a company that's not publicly traded, but they still have a Hoover's page. It won't be as full. That may not have the most financial data, but it will have the org chart. It will still have the other subsidiaries, who their competitors are, and probably some like gossip and trends, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So Hoover's is still a good bet for about a third of the U.S. Independent non-traded companies.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to that, I would recommend for non-traded companies is I kind of lost my thought there. I was sorry, but is to when you go to the yes, now I remember what I was going to say. I got a little sidetracked. Here's what I would say. In that case, think of who a competitor is that is publicly traded, and do some research on the competitor, because a tight competitor, because there will be quite a bit of overlap in some basic information, not the org chart, not the mission statement, but generally, if your competitor, your company's competitor will have the same other competitors, the industry trends will be the same, you can still speak to those things in the interview. So finding a competitor that is being traded would be my bet, and then you can critically think your way to crossing over that information to what applies to your company that you're interviewing for.
And there is a research source for private companies. It's called Capital IQ. Very few institutions have access to it. It's incredibly expensive.
It is incredibly expensive.
If you're a student at one of, for example, one of the large major business schools, you tend to have access to it. If you're an alumnus of one of those places, sometimes you can get temporary access to it or have one of the research librarians. But sometimes even the big, like if you happen to be in Chicago, like maybe the big city libraries like the Harold Washington Library, they may have a subscription. But I think Patty's right. I mean, if you can't get those, super awesome resources, there are other ways. And whether it's through a company's LinkedIn page, interviews with executives, which sometimes exist on video, sometimes they're in other publications. So be a little bit resourceful. And if it's, startups, there are some, interesting profiles of startup companies. Sometimes the investors in those companies have information on their website. So, it's just learning to dig a little bit and being focused on what you're looking for, I think helps you sift through a lot of that mass of information that's out there.
Pam, I also wanted to say that one of the things that this gets you, whether you have only 24 hours to do kind of a broad research or whether you have a week, you know what I mean? Some of us have a week when they call you, is when you, and Pam's going to talk about this later about how to kind of craft some aspects of your resume to your storytelling. When you have this research and you've kind of organized it in your outline, think about how to weave this research into your storytelling, or where in your resume does some of this research overlap. And when you go to practice your interviewing, have your research notes also with you. Bring a short page of research notes with you to your interview, and practice where you want to put in research reference into your interviewing practicing.
Great. And I think, what I would offer everyone as just some personal experience, I think you don't have to spend hours and hours and hours doing research. Knowing a core set of things about an organization, about the people that you might be interviewing with, if you're given those names in advance, and something about their background. But Patty's comment about mission and values, I mean, even large, big makers of things, for-profit companies, ultimately they have mission and values, and you can see that thread through their marketing. You can see it thread into the job postings that they write, and just getting a better understanding of that and being able to articulate that, it makes an enormous difference. But even just gaps that I often see is simple things like not being aware of the products or the services or the industries that company serves. So it is very fascinating how even an hour or two of research can have a very high payback in terms of your connecting for the key things that the interviewer is looking for.
That is very well phrased. I think there is definitely a return on time investment with just simply an hour or two of getting a feel for the company and the industry that they're working within, or the industries, and doing just a little bit of structured research will really pay off.
Fantastic. So before we kind of press into a couple of these other topics, any other questions about research? Even if you guys want to share other research sort of sources that you maybe have found helpful, things that we can just elaborate on a little bit more. feel free to put a comment in the chat, or if you have a question live, go ahead and take yourself off mute and pose that question. So there's a question, what are some things that people forget to research?
Yeah, so here's a couple things I'll tell you when I've been in, and Pam, you can answer this too, since you've been on the hiring side, you know what I mean, is I would say people often forget to research trends, and they often don't look at whether the company's been in the news lately, so what is in development, like R&D, or like what's in the pipeline, or what's the hot gossip and stuff like that. And sometimes I think people forget to research what other divisions or other areas are in the company. Does that make sense? Am I phrasing that right?
Yes.
Those are areas that often are not looked at, and so and often are noticed in the interview.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'll give you guys a few simple examples. I work with a lot of students that are interviewing with consulting firms. At the end of the year, 2019, one of the big consulting firms changed their name. So they went from being known as A.T. Kearney to being known as Kearney. Now, that may seem like a really simple thing, but if you literally had not looked on their website within like a 2-week period, you might have missed that. And so think about the candidate that saw it versus the candidate that didn't. That's one really simple example.
Yeah. Can I do a real quick one too, Pam?
Yeah, please.
So I had a student who I adored working with, and he was interviewing at banks, and a couple bank interviews. And one of the things his research led him to is that the bank, one of the places he was interviewing, which was US Bank, has a reputation for actually they have a really good culture there of really helping young people come up, and they have a strong mentoring culture. And he found that out by doing research about news articles about them. I think he was looking at Crane Chicago Business. So when they asked him straight up, like, why do you want to be here? He was like, well, I read in Crane's that you are very committed to mentoring and new hires. And it was the perfect answer. Like, they even said later it was the perfect answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, there's so many things that probably Patty and I could list. I tend to try to find things that when I'm looking at a company or an organization, I say to myself, wow, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, some years ago, I was interviewing with a consulting firm called Booz Allen Hamilton. At the time, it's called Strategy and today through some mergers. And I came across, it just so happened at the exact time I was interviewing, I found a book that had been released by Booz Allen Hamilton because it was their 90th anniversary. And what I got the book on eBay. I mean, that may sound a little bit crazy, but I learned things about the history of that company and its evolution. And one of the partners that I ended up interviewing with, his picture was in the book. And I asked a question about how that celebration occurred and what it meant to him. And I think he was completely astonished that I had any idea that they had just celebrated their 90th anniversary. And I mean, it is a little bit weird that I ordered the book, but that, you know, and I had more than 3 days to do this, so please take that with some awareness. But my point is, you find a few things that it's like, wow, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. Or it goes back a little bit further historically to see the evolution of the company. As another example, I met a gentleman, he came to one of my classes that I taught, who had worked for Microsoft for 25 years. And one of his comments was that he had worked for the only 3 leaders of Microsoft. Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, and now Satya Nadella. And it just occurred to me that that would be a really interesting thing to research a little bit were I going into that company to interview. So I think if you all translate that to look at the present state of the company, look back
Mm-hmm.
historically, and then look forward and see what the company is pursuing and some of their challenges. And that gives you a really interesting lens to then think about what that hiring manager might be looking for. A couple of other questions or comments. Someone talks about listening to earnings calls for public companies. I think that's a great suggestion. And you never know what kinds of things you're going to find by looking at LinkedIn. Even I've done company research on Facebook. So, knowing the perception of the company by their customers, by the marketplace, by employees, I think those are maybe, just from my point of view, a few other elements as well. So Patty, any last comments before we talk about a couple of other interviewing aspects?
No, I think I might jump in as you move on because there's some synergy between what you're going to talk about and weaving some research in. So you might hear from me in a little bit.
Yeah, cool.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to make a couple of comments for the next few minutes that focuses much more on the aspect of the interview about what you're going to speak. And I wrap this around two key ideas. So one is the planning for your interview and the stories that you pick to talk about. And then the second aspect is practicing. And I'm going to do this conversation, and I've got up on the screen a job posting. I just went out to LinkedIn last night, looked up a job posting that I thought had robust requirements to it. So we can use this as some backdrop. So all of you likely have either applied to a position by way of a job posting, you've received information from the company. It could be a lot, it could be a little. But the job posting is one of the things that very much guides our planning. Now, in some circumstances, planning and the stories that you pick, they are guided by the job posting, but the job posting can also be the tip of the iceberg. There could be more things that the hiring manager is looking for. And on top of it, not all organizations write their job descriptions in the same way. This company, which happens to be Simple Mills here in Chicago, they include a lot of information in their job posting. They talk a little bit about the role, the responsibilities. They talk about the culture of the company. They give you specific instructions about the cover letter. Those things are likely going to be discussed in your interview. Not all companies are this robust, and then some companies are even more robust. So thinking about the fact that when you come to the planning stage, you've got the research that you've done and you've got the job posting. And you're trying to prepare now for this question, tell me about a time when. I think there's a few things that help in this process. And again, to try to focus because time may be limited. One is to thoroughly review the job posting, review it twice, 3 times. And I like to mark up job postings. I'd like to highlight the things that exactly align to my background. Like there is 100% match and I've done it over and over again. And then I like to notate things where I have some experience gaps, where I've either not done it or I've only done it in an academic setting, or if I've done it, but it's a little bit weak. And that gives me a planning framework. So the things that align perfectly are my strengths. and the experience that I'm going to bring to the table. The things that are gaps, I'm going to have to anticipate how I might ask questions about that, how important it is. If I'm given a direct question, tell me about a time when you had to do XYZ, I have a way to answer that question with confidence. So going through step one, analyzing the job description and using it as a framework to help align your experience is extremely important. That then enables you to do the second big step, which is to consider the key experiences that you've had in your background that align to what the hiring manager is looking for. And those experiences should be specific. So when I've interviewed people and I ask the question, can you tell me about a time when you put together an e-commerce strategy? That's very generic. And I get answers that are like, well, I've done that 3 or 4 times. In my last job, I had to prepare that strategy. It's too vague. The method of interviewing is, let me tell you about this specific e-commerce strategy. Last year in my role, I was dealing with our product related to this. Here's what I did. Here's how I put the strategy together. Here were the results. Like, it's got to be a very specific example. And therefore, when you're considering your background, which is likely in your resume, as well as other things that might not have made it to your resume, you've got general skills, which are things like your leadership and your influence and problem solving and creativity and how you work with teams. You've got the job specific skills, which are all the things that line up to a job posting like this. And then you've got company specific things, which are from all that research that Patty just talked about. So if you look over at this job description, and it's kind of subtle, but they've got a little phrase in here, and you may have found this in your research, do you have a desire to make a positive impact on the food industry? It might be great if there's something in your background where maybe you did a project in college around the food industry. Maybe you do volunteer work for a food bank. There's some evidence. So those are company specific things that align to the culture, the values, etc. So picking examples from your background that align to these general skills that cross all companies, the job specific skills that are lined out in this type of a posting, and then another set of skills, experiences, activities that align to the company specific skills, culture, values. Having that inventory is critical. And then if there are places where you have gaps, then what you're trying to do is to find the most relevant experience. And so when you're asked a question about it, you can say, no, I haven't had experience with that exact thing, but I have this other experience which I think I could build upon. And that gives the hiring manager the best chance to figure out, again, how much training might you need and can they live with that? So that thinking, this planning about the best examples from your work history and this alignment to the companies, that story picking process is really critical. In my work, as I'm training some people and helping them in my coaching role, we might take a question, like talk about a time when you had to influence someone, and we might evaluate 3 different examples and which one fits the best. And maybe one of those examples happens to be in a relevant industry, and so it gets higher up on the priority list. That's worth its weight in gold. Again, a huge ROI, because I've had people tell me a fantastic story. They've delivered it in a very articulate way. It just isn't as relevant given the question I've asked, or it isn't as relevant to my company. So some examples of that, even from my own experience, a few years back, I interviewed at a major university to lead their career office. And I was asked a question about how have I picked up on trends and emerging developments in the career space. And I went through this, portfolio of experiences that I had over 8-9 years of being a career coach. And I thought about one that picked up on a need of a student population that I was supporting that wanted to work on careers in social impact, and built a program around that and worked within the career office and the broader business school to bring that program to life. And it had a tangible outcome. So there were, maybe 10 different choices, but I picked that example because it had some dramatic effects within the organization I was working with. But then I also knew that it was a trend that would have been of interest to that organization. So thinking about those things can be very, very helpful. One of the last things I'll say about planning is that the interview, and some of you may have found this, the interview, it's stressful. It has a lot going on. Things move fast. You kind of have this out-of-body experience. And so being thoughtful about how you plan the things that you're going to say. And I think about examples like walk me through your resume. I love and hate that question. As a hiring manager, I've asked that question thousands of times. And I usually brace myself because it can go great and it can go bad. I was involved with a hiring committee, and we asked one of the candidates that question, and 25 minutes later, they finished answering the question, walk me through your resume. And unfortunately, at that point, the interview was done, because that is not a 25-minute answer. That is a 2 to 3 minute answer. And it just occurred to me, perhaps either the person misunderstood what the intent of the question was, or just hadn't planned and was kind of working on the fly. But the problem was it just left all those questions to doubt. And clearly it resulted in a negative outcome. So it may, again, I'm not trying to be overly simplistic, but thinking a little bit about the flow of the interview and what the hiring manager might ask you, and then working backwards, that goes a long, long way. And even if you have to do that in a day, what I often say is think about your 10 best professional experiences, and then think about how those experiences can adapt to multiple questions. All right. So that leads me to kind of the last major point that I want to make around the interview process. And again, I don't intend to be overly simplistic, but I think one of the things that sometimes is skipped by candidates is actually practicing what you're going to say. And I find this, I do hiring even in my job today. I work with many individuals, and there's some hesitation we have to kind of interview ourselves, to voice things out loud. It's kind of weird, but the process of putting your thoughts together, outlining them, and then speaking them out loud has huge benefit. And so if you're going to be interviewing anytime soon, think about the structures of how answers to interviews should be organized. Some people talk about the STAR framework, STAR. Some people talk about the SOAR framework, SOAR. They're mostly the same. Situation, T is for task, O is for objective or obstacle. The A is your actions, the R is the result. So trying to get in the habit of answering wrapped around that framework and being concise, that is for some of us not natural. I find myself, I introduce myself all the time. I'm constantly answering what seem like interview questions when I'm speaking to clients about proposals and possibly doing work together. Yet when I interview and I run through some of my answers, they might take 6-7 minutes the first go round. And I don't always adhere to that structure. So I have to remind myself to kind of practice and edit. But having that structure in place is really valuable. And even if your structure is as simple as beginning, middle, end, that's very, very valuable. So when you go through it and you think about those notes, the practicing, what it allows you to do is put thoughts on paper, which builds the mental aspect of interviewing, which is remembering the details of your work, really honing in on the actions that you took. This is one of the big gaps, is sometimes we feel like we need to be generous and we speak about the team and what the team accomplished. The interview is about you, and don't be afraid to talk about what you did and why it was special, and be very clear about results. And I think that in this environment, when you consider how you're going to talk about your experiences, speaking about working under pressure, speaking about working under resource constraints, speaking about having to move quickly and be adaptable, and really honing in on the impact of your work is something that hiring managers will normally want to hear from you. But I think there's a heightened sensitivity to that just because of the uncertainty today. If you look at this job posting that I have here on the screen, it talks about needing to start in a remote environment. So adding in some dimensions of adaptability and being kind of go with the flow, but yet being decisive, weaving those into your stories and really practicing how you're going to speak to that. The other element of practice that I want to mention is there are difficult questions that we are asked. Why are you looking for a job? Why did you get terminated from your position? Why have you been out of work for so long? When was a time that you failed? What were your weaknesses? Again, in the best of times, these are tough questions. They put us on the spot. We have to talk about things that make us uncomfortable, and practicing your answers over and over with a friend, with a partner, can be helpful because it allows you to just speak very factually. And I think not dwelling on too many of the, shall we say, kind of the details of the circumstances. For any of you who've lost positions in the past month or so, no one is going to really question that in a way that sort of sheds a light on this, that maybe there was something at fault by you. Many people have lost positions, And I think it's talking about how the company had to downsize. And as a result, you found yourself out of work. Practicing saying that is important, because if the first time you're saying it is in the interview, that's really hard, because the truth is it's emotional. I've been in situations where I was not quite terminated, but on the very edge. And I know my first interview under that stress condition, my voice wavered. And I think if I had practiced a little bit more, it would have been better. Now, over time, it got better because I separated myself from the emotion. And it's okay to be emotional, and people will understand it, but it's a little bit better if you can work out some of that, whether it's, the upset of it, whether it's the anger, those types of things, and just being able to speak to it very matter-of-factly. So the practice element is really valuable. And the goal of your practice is to get answers to be concise but structured. 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes for a typical answer is best practice. How do you speak naturally? I'm having a conversation, Patty's having a conversation. We both have notes, but hopefully it doesn't sound completely like we're reading off of our notes. That's what you want to have, that balance of, I thought about what I want to say, but I'm speaking it to you in a conversation. There's also a dimension of the energy and the confidence in your voice. And when you're under pressure, that is even more difficult. And so I was actually on the phone earlier today with a client of mine who's doing some interview practice. And we talked about how to prepare for that pressure and having some fun stories, some strong images, the music on your phone that pumps you up, and practicing to be confident. Because that's one of the things that I think when we're under these pressured situations, I can, as a hiring manager, even on a video interview, I can see it in your face. I can see it in your body language. And if I'm looking between two candidates, I'm just naturally wanting to have a sense that the person I'm going to hire, in spite of really difficult circumstances, has that degree of confidence. So I think you can practice that. And you can watch it if you video yourself while you're doing some of that practice. And what accompanies that is practicing smiling. I know it sounds perhaps, again, a little bit simplistic, but that's one of the things that I repeat over and over when I'm having the chance to do mock interviews with people, is just smile, because it will give you a lot of great energy surrounding the kinds of things that you're saying. So the practice can be really simple. You guys don't need any fancy software. Just use the video recording on your mobile phones, or use whatever's on your laptop, and ask yourself questions. Get on a webinar with friends of yours, Google Hangouts or whatever tool you have at your disposal that's free, and just run through interview questions. If you have access to Alumni Career Services, definitely use that. If you're a student and you have career services on your campus, definitely use that, and see if you can get, even a 30-minute mock interview to get some of that run through. All right. So any questions about, there's lots of details that we could get into about interviewing, but I think, Patty and I really wanted to focus on research techniques, planning, anticipating some things, how to work the kinks out, and get yourself as game ready as possible. But there's clearly a lot of other things that we can speak to as it comes to interviewing. Does anybody have any particular questions that maybe we could hit on for a few minutes?
So Pam, do you would you recommend timing yourself when you do your like resume walkthrough?
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I know that when I've had to do it, I mean, occasionally I have to walk through my resume in kind of a formal way. So I even do this. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I'll pull up, like I have QuickTime on my laptop and I'll run through it and record it. And sometimes I don't even listen to it because the first run through is like 7 or 8 minutes.
Mm.
And then and this is a technique that and thanks for asking that question, Patty, not only recording it, but then immediately do it again
Mm.
because that first run through, it's almost like a warm up. And then the second time you run through it, you've already picked up on a few things that you didn't like the first time. And then maybe do it a third time and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
do all that, whether you're recording it on your mobile phone or your laptop. I think all that is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
A couple questions I'm seeing in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
So the question about your biggest weakness, what's a good example? So here's what I would offer if you guys are asked a question like that. You want a weakness that is in fact a weakness. We all have weaknesses. It's how you phrase, it's how you speak to that weakness. And of course, not blowing the weakness out of proportion or making it sound like your coworker Zilla. And then I think also there are weaknesses that just, it doesn't sound like you've thought through it deeply. So the reason that employers ask about weaknesses, if I go back and take us there, one, I want to know if you're somebody who self-assesses or hears feedback, because that's how you learn about your weaknesses. Secondly, I want to know if you have the confidence to tell me what your weakness is. So I have plenty of professional weaknesses. If you guys ask Patty, she probably could list a very long group of them. So one of my weaknesses is that I have extremely high expectations, almost to the point of perfectionism. And if I do not communicate in certain ways, it can make the people on my team feel like nothing they do is good enough. And so, as a leader, as someone who's communicating, I try to ask a lot of questions. I try to pick my battles and I try to help people self assess and think about the tone of the way I speak. Okay. So, Jenna, you've asked that question. I think you pick the weakness, you focus on how it is that you address your weakness to
Yeah.
be a more productive and positive team member. And then you can also address how that weakness has changed over time.
It also, if I can jump in here, it also shows it, articulating your strategy for addressing your weakness also shows a mindfulness of how you see yourself in a work environment.
Yep.
And it allows you an opportunity to talk about how you interact with a team.
Yeah.
And the team part will be what the interviewer hears.
Yep. That's right. There's another question, Patty, about how to answer the question, why do you want to leave your current job?
Mm.
I guess
I
I'm
got
gonna.
asked that one recently.
I know. So Patty left her job recently. I hired her, but just thoughtfully, Patty, what are some suggestions that you have, and I'm curious, sort of your take on that.
Yeah, so I think there's and this is where practicing and having people hear how you articulate that to refine it's a really good piece of advice. But this is where you talk about perhaps your own alignment with mission vision. Um, that it's, you know, interviewers are always saying we're looking for the right fit, but it's something to kind of turn it and say, I'm looking for the right fit. The place I was at is a good company. They're doing good work, but I'm seeking the right fit for me. And that is a way to address that question.
Mm-hmm. I would
What do you
also
think, Pam?
add, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I would add a couple of kind of general thoughts and then a couple specific things. So in
Mm-hmm.
general, don't think like you have to give a speech about a
Yeah.
question like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's helpful to talk about your professional goals. My career goals are, and when I think about the steps that I want to take, I want to move forward in a way that moves me into a position where I have greater scope to impact the company that I'm a part of. And when I saw this role, I knew that it was something that I could come in and make a big impact. So I think it's almost not talking about why you want to leave your current job.
Yeah,
It's pivoting a little bit about why you're really interested in this job.
I would concur with that. Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And and I think having that sense of what it is you're moving towards is helpful. Most hiring managers, like, look, some of us,
Mm-hmm.
we're fairly aware that you wouldn't be interviewing unless there was something not well aligned in your current position, unless the opportunity of a lifetime swirled out of the sky. So spend a little bit of less emphasis on why you're leaving your current job and maybe transition that question to be much more about what it is you're looking forward to. In some specific things, I've heard people very effectively talk about environment of the company. I'm looking for a smaller company. I'm looking for a much larger company. I see the mission that I want to be a part of. There's a product category that you see that better fits the skills and the interests that you have. So I think if you anchor around business needs, that also helps. Like business needs that align with your professional goals. That would probably be the way that I would think about that. And to be honest, I mean, people do slip into a little bit of, my current job, I feel like I'm a little sidetracked or I've gotten pigeonholed. The company's not growing. I I think a hiring manager, again, because we're risk averse, worries that that projects some negativity. And then when you face those exact same issues again inside my organization, that then you'll be looking to move on as well. So, definitely trying to think more about the opportunity ahead. Okay. There's another question about how to guess the non-obvious questions. I guess in some ways, to be honest, I wouldn't worry about that. Um, if a hiring manager asks you a non-obvious question, there are one of two reasons. I mean, there could be more than two, but this would be my take. One would be they're expecting to catch you off guard and they're trying to see how you answer in an impromptu moment. The way you respond by being thoughtful, maybe pausing, using a structure like a beginning, middle, end, The other reason that a hiring manager is asking you a non-obvious question is they like to just throw curveballs and stress you. So the intention is that it's a stress question. I do know people that have been asked, if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? So guessing, I wouldn't necessarily try to guess. What I do think in your practice is have a few of the individuals that are helping you practice throw some curveballs at you and learn to be impromptu. Patty, do you have any other thoughts on that? Have you ever been asked a weird, non-obvious question besides me?
No, actually, well, so I think I actually had not so much weird, non-obvious, sometimes questions that they're not personal, but they seem personal, and you're a little caught off guard by them. So it's not unusual or it's not obvious, but they'll say, like, name a hobby you have. You know what I mean? And that's often the thing you didn't practice. Like, right, how do you answer a hobby? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I had a client who actually said, I love Dungeons and Dragons, and proceeded to share how being a dungeon master helped with critical thinking and decision making. You know what I mean? But they were very thrown off by the question. And it seemed almost personal, but it is sometimes they'll sneak things like that they appear personal, but they're not really into the interview mix.
Mm-hmm. What I sometimes try to suggest is about 80% of the questions in an interview you can likely predict. It's going to be okay if 20% of them are a little bit flying out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
So a thoughtful response and kind of being prepared for the unprepared helps you, because what Patty's saying I think is the case. Like, the interviewer is just trying to see, do you look like a deer in headlights? Because maybe I'm trying to, again, stress test or see how you deal with ambiguity.
It's to see how you respond to uncomfortableness.
Yep. Do you squirm? Do you smile and say, wow,
Mm-hmm.
I haven't been asked that question before. That's awesome. Let me think about it.
Mm-hmm.
There's another question about being rehearsed versus conversation. Patty, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, we did some interviews today, and I'm thinking about that myself, of how do you, and I was actually coaching a client of mine earlier today about that. How do you maintain that balance in the interview?
Well, I think so. I think when you are at the stage of your career where you're going through a lot of interviewing with interviewing practice, or you're going through a lot of interviewing in like a cohort, like a lot of you and your friends are all in the same situation. Getting a pool of people to practice the interviewing with is really, really important. To kind of have that practice of answering questions unsystematically is very helpful. And I would say that would be your first kind of go-to. And that will lead to the conversation. Also, being able to answer questions a little deeper, like with a follow-up sentence, that's actually conversation. You know what I mean? Having just one answer, a bullet point for every question you're asked, is not a conversation, but being able to engage back and forth or add more to your initial response, that's where the conversation happens.
100% agree. I like that point you just made about practicing, like, almost questions out of sequence,
Mm-hmm.
so that you're forced to think a little bit on your feet. I think that's a good technique. I'm gonna remember that. So I want to do this. I want to make a couple of closing comments, but Patty and I maybe we'll stick on the webinar for a few more minutes for other questions, but I just want to make a few summary
Sure.
points for people that have to drop off at 7:30. We're right there. So pressure right now, lots of pressure. I'm going to offer you guys a couple of suggestions. Breathe, constantly breathe. I notice at times when I'm working or driving, I clench my teeth, I grip my hands. And when I feel myself doing that, I try to stop and, relax, and I take a deep breath. I mean, it sounds kind of stupid, but I find that works tremendously. And I even invested in one of those Apple Watches, which apparently reminds me to do that periodically. So breathe. I also think finding things that are positive about you and your prior performance matters. And even if you have a friend who can tell you how awesome you are, a friend, a parent, a family member, and just reminding yourself of that. I mean, I face doubt and sometimes rejection multiple times a week. I'm emailing people because I want to have a networking conversation. I'm presenting proposals to clients. I hear things in the background about, things that I'm working on and maybe challenges to them. We all have things in our world that creep in this attack on our confidence and bring about self-doubt. And so when I need that moment, I find something. For me, I might go talk to my kids who in that moment think I'm awesome. And having, my 7-year-old say, "You're the most awesome mom out there." I'm like, "That's great. Tell me that again." Of course, they don't know any other moms, so there's no comparison. But like having that simple message, I think makes a big deal under stress conditions. And then I would find for yourself things that help you build endurance. I've had a couple of clients that have been interviewing. They've been interviewing at a very, the same company, quite honestly. And they do these 5-hour back-to-back interviews. If you guys think about that, that is extremely mentally and physically challenging to be sitting doing this webinar like this, but being pounded with questions. I have done panel interviews with 8 people staring at me, bombarding me with questions. It is physically exhausting. So for you and who you are, how do you build the endurance to kind of withstand that mental and physical fatigue? When I post the notes for this webinar, I'll post an article that I read about chess players who do physical training like Olympic athletes, because apparently a chess match for grandmasters is super exhausting. So if you build that around the techniques of preparing for the interview, I think it makes a big difference. And, kind of my closing comment in this regard, and then we'll come back to some of the questions. My closing comment for all of you is this: if you do not believe in yourself, the hiring manager cannot believe in you. If you believe that you're good enough, that you can do the job, that you'd be a tremendous asset to the organization, then you give me a chance to believe that as well. So your mindset plays a critical part of this. So formally, we're gonna wrap up. Thank you guys again. I'll send out an email with the link to the webinar, but it will also be on our website. And as you guys are dropping off, if you have a topic or some other job search, stress environment questions that you think would be helpful for us to build a webinar around, put those suggestions in the chat. You can also email them to me. And have a great rest of the week. And with that, I'm going to go back to a couple of the questions
Mm-hmm.
to continue our conversation here, Patty, for a few
Are you
minutes.
looking at Jenna's?
Yes, I am.
Mm-hmm. This is a good one, but a tough one.
What are some questions that might be asked of you in a creative position interview, like a creative test type scenario? I talked to some people recently that said they had to prove their abilities in projects. How best to prepare for something like that that might be more on the spot than a take-home assignment? Oh, that
Yeah.
is a good question.
Yeah.
Patty,
So I think,
thoughts?
well, my first thought um, is one, I'll do the first part, and Pam, then you can kind of jump in and refine my answer. If you're interviewing for a job that has application like that, you know what I mean? Sometimes that could be a data analytics job or a programming job or a web design or UX. I think it's okay to email back to the HR or the contact person. Is there anything that's going to be like that in the interview? Like, what are some scenarios that might be asked? You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
I did when I was interviewing for a job a year ago. So here's kind of the connector with that. I knew someone who used to work there, and I went back to him and I asked him, "What did they ask you in the interview?" And they didn't bring up some of the stuff that he mentioned. So I actually emailed and said, "Hey, just asking, is there anything special I should be prepared to do during your interview?" And they
Mm-hmm,
gave me a couple scenarios that might happen.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I know that seems kind of a roundabout answer, and Pam, maybe you can clean that answer up a little bit, but that is one approach, and it does happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about a few things.
Mm-hmm.
So one is, so I do a lot of training for case interviews. That's kind of an on the spot.
Mm-hmm.
It's often for consulting jobs, but even there's a variety of corporate roles, marketing, brand management. Sometimes they use case scenarios that you're just sort of impromptu. So you can prepare for that by researching the different case scenarios that people are given in interviews. You can do that by way of, a simple Google search and some of the case interview tools. You can also look at some information about company specific interviews. Glassdoor has a lot of great information about questions that are asked. Sometimes sites like Reddit or Quora have
Mm-hmm.
company specific questions. And it depends a little bit on what you mean by creative. If it's for design, that might be a scenario, and how would you do that? And I think in addition to kind of looking at some of those sources, think through some of your own projects and how did you do it? Kind of describe how did you come up with that idea? Or if it's for someone who's an architect, what was the building that you built and how did you come up with the design thesis for that? If it's a social media campaign, what was your inspiration? And then think about your field and just run yourself through a bunch of scenarios, maybe get some of your colleagues, some of your friends to just run you through some scenarios and do them on the spot. Because I'm thinking about this kind of on the spot versus take home. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that, Jenna, because the interviewing that we're doing right now, we have a take home assignment. It's given a week in advance. Everybody had to prepare it, send us a PowerPoint, and then we're having them review the PowerPoint. So it's that take home. That's very, very different than on the spot. So summarizing, all those things, do your research, try to find some company specific things, and then practice. And really narrow down to what maybe some of those creative scenarios could be, because it probably is very role specific, right? Like I know someone in brand management who was asked one time, to take a product and do a competitive analysis, like in the interview. I've been heard people that were asked, here's the product, you're trying to increase revenue, design one marketing campaign. How would it look? Talk. So those are really hard things to do. So hopefully that gives you some ideas. If not, we can fill in a little bit more. Another question, Patty, how do you respond to the question about salary expectations? Oh, good question.
Ooh, yeah.
Good question. So one thing I'll say, and then Patty and I can talk about this. You guys should know that many of the states within the United States have now passed laws that you cannot be asked about your salary history. So I know, Cliff, that's not the question you're asking, but just be aware of that. And so how do we answer that question? Interview strategy says don't answer the question. Ask the interviewer or the hiring manager or the HR person, could you better understand the scope of the role and if they have a budget for the position or the range? Because it's a tricky, it's a little bit of a slippery slope.
And it can sometimes be a trick question. Like we were talking about those curveballs, and
Yep.
it is sometimes people, so depending on the kind of interviewing you're doing, right, in a certain kind of scenario, whether you're doing that panel or whether you're doing those multiple people in one day, often one of them gets told to ask you that question to see, really for nothing else, just to see how you react.
Mm-hmm.
It's the deer in headlights.
Yeah. And my second suggestion, Cliff, is I'm taking into Patty's territory here, but do your research.
That's fine.
Almost all mainstream positions, you can find salary information on Glassdoor, and it won't cost you anything to get it. And if you can, either through Glassdoor, some companies in their job postings, if you have like LinkedIn Premium, which I'm not advocating for that, but sometimes you can get salary ranges. This can enable you to research what for that position the typical salary is, and then you have to, if it's for a very large company, you'll get specific salaries. And then if you're really, really pushed to the corner, I would go in the top 75th percentile of the salary range. Because some companies are philosophically, they want to pay top tier salaries to get top tier talent. And other companies want to try to get a bargain and require you to negotiate up.
I would say also, if you're interviewing for a boutique company that won't have that posted, it's not a Glassdoor, or that particular information is not going to be because they are boutique. Some of the investment firms in Chicago and stuff will be so boutique you won't find that information easily. I would research up to their national competitor and then align back to that boutique. Their range, if they're small and upcoming, you're going to have to do a little bit of math about where that range will be. If they've been around a long time, even if they're boutique, their salary will be in alignment with their larger competitors.
And I guess my final bit of advice, I have experienced over the years that most professionals, when taking a new position, should have a salary increase. I mean, it should be 10 to 15%. If you're in a position where the supply demand equation works in your favor, it might be
Mm-hmm.
20%. If you're going to a company that is accelerating, it could be even more. But then, for our environment right now, you have to calibrate that because it just may not seem feasible. But the downside is when a company perceives that you might be going backwards, that is a concern in an environment like this, because what they then forecast is when the economy picks back up, you're going to leave to go back to get on the salary, line that you were previously on. So at times we think that it's good to say, well, salary doesn't matter. I'm really willing to come in and prove myself. The thing is, you become a risk at that stage. So there's this very interesting, I think, analytic approach, summarizing what we've said. Do your research to figure out what the relevant range is for the position. Look at yourself and what your salary trajectory is. If asked, first try to get a sense of the budgeted range for the position. And and then you can kind of think a little bit about how you're going to respond. And some of it, if we come down to the direct part of your question, you can always say, my salary expectations are between X and Y. I, however, am incredibly excited about this opportunity. I'd like the opportunity to interview. The scope seems really interesting, and I could see the long-term possibility of this position. And so if you think my salary range is out of alignment with the position, let me know that, but let's not make that be an impediment to me being a candidate. You kind of have to position it the right way. But I have seen people get themselves way out of whack answering that question. And by out of whack, meaning they've either given too much flexibility that makes it seem like you're a little bit desperate, or they've set a number that the company then comes back with something below that, and it's just not doable given your sort of professional place, or it's so low that the company knows that you're a flight risk. All right, so hopefully that helps with salary areas. And that's a good, I'm going to make a note about that, because I think that, Patty, that's something in a follow-up webinar we could even talk a little bit about. So Clifton, if you're still with us, hopefully that gives you a few ideas. And I know a few
Actually,
people are still
can
with
I
us.
can I ask you a question, Pam, to build on
Yeah.
Cliff's?
Yeah.
Is it, depending on when that question's asked, because it's almost a loaded question, you know what I mean? Is it okay to say I'm looking at the total compensation package? You know what I mean? Like, is there more ways to answer that are still ambiguous? You know what I mean?
Um,
It is a tricky question,
Sort of.
and
Yeah.
I have
Yeah.
answered it well at times, and I have answered it poorly, and I've had
Yeah.
clients who've gone both ways.
Yeah. I'm the same. I've probably blown that question more than a handful of um I think you have to be careful with total comp,
Mhm.
because then the worry I always have is that the person you're speaking to thinks that you're being evasive.
Mm, okay,
So,
fair.
base comp trumps everything. Now, if it's a startup, that's a whole different thing.
Okay.
Or if it's a company that has enormous perks. I think if I synthesize a little bit of what we're talking about, do your homework.
Yep.
If it's a company that's got a high flying stock price in a strong growth position, they want you to be aggressive and they want you to earn your salary. If it's a company that's struggling a little bit, they want to know that that they're not in a position to be paying salary at the 90th percentile. So
if it's a company that prides itself on culture, and that's something you'll also find out in your interviewing, then they're looking for more of a culture fit than a income fit.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
so
and they might pay at the 75th percentile because you've got other qualitative aspects.
Mm-hmm. And they're looking for someone who's seeking that culture fit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Other questions for anyone who's still with us before we conclude our evening? All right.
Do you, Pam, do you offer coach sessions?
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry, say again?
Do you offer coach sessions, like have coach one-on-one?
To coach you as a client or to train you how to be a coach?
To coach as a client. Remember, I'm from Chicago Booth. Remember, like close to the interview season, then you have like a one-on-one coach sessions. Each one can schedule like 30 minutes. Then go through a couple of questions.
Yep, absolutely. I have a couple different options for that right now. So if that's something you or others are interested in, email me. There's a few things on my website already, but if you're, if you want to do something there, just reach out. And everything right now is happening virtually, so it's really easy to make some of that work. So we're very happy to do that.
Cool. Thanks.
Awesome. All right. All right, everyone. Thank you again. Appreciate your attention. Hope you guys found this valuable, useful. I know I learned a few things as always, and appreciate your questions. Have a great rest of the week.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Pat. Or Pam, sorry.
That's okay. Anytime, Patty. Take care.